We're live almost.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, we've got another opportunity to study together today. Hopefully, for those who are able to join us, you're ready to participate in the text of James chapter 5. So far, joining us is Adam Shanks. I've known Adam's family for a while. I think this is our first virtual face-to-face interaction. We've chatted a little bit otherwise. Adam, how are you doing today?
Doing very well. Very well. Thank you.
Terry, are you all right? Are you okay? He's an extrovert in a cage with a bunch of extroverts.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be with Adam. For those who don't know, Adam and I were co-workers for about 4 years in Memphis, and we're about 30 minutes apart now, and we continue to meet on somewhat of a regular basis. Even met yesterday for a couple hours virtually, and I admire Adam a lot, despite the fact that the first time I remember Adam was when he was a little kid, and he's directly responsible for giving me second-degree sunburns. So, but by aggravating an existing sunburn, and I've extended mercy to him, but I'm going to remind him of that till he dies. That's basically where we're at on that story, Adam.
As you should. I appreciate that. So we'll get in the text just a second. Just a couple of quick reminders. So first things first, we're looking at the text of James. It is an echo or a side-by-side reading or an expanded notes edition of the Sermon on the Mount in many ways, or the broader teaching of Jesus. If you're aware, you can slowly map out almost the same structure from parts of the Sermon on the Mount in the way that James approaches the present distress for the Christians in Jerusalem that are being spread everywhere, but also as he deals with the narrower focus that kind of appears around chapter 3 through the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5. For this study here, we're going to be looking hopefully at verses 7 through 12 or so, maybe 11, maybe 7 through 8, who knows. The more preachers you get into a dialogue, the slower everything goes. So with that being the case, and we've kind of narrowed it down to where we're at, probably good for us to go ahead and begin to read the text. Terry, do you want to read for us from verses 7 to, let's do 7 to 11 right now. We'll add verse 12 later if need be.
All right. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we considered those blessed who remained steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful.
So there's a bit of a shift in the tone from verses 1 through 6 in the chapter to 7 through 11, 7 through 12. But there's some contextual cues that in some ways he's talking to the same people because of the way he phrases and words things together. So let's go ahead and just start picking apart the imagery here. Verse 7, verse 8 or so. What do you all see in the text there that is important for us to pay attention to today? Either or, go first. There's no structure here, Adam, so you get to finally talk over Terry as much as you want.
That's never happened, never will. He's always the louder one.
Yeah.
So the very obvious is the therefore. I use the Christian Standard Bible, so therefore, we always make the point that it connects the two passages, the two sections, and I think it's very appropriate that the beginning of chapter 5 has all of those. I think we'd probably say negative words at least, even if it's a positive message. But then it moves on into talking about the prophets, which were probably the greatest example in Scripture of those who were willing to endure and suffer the negative things of, consequences of serving God. And I find that to kind of draw all of this together, that there really is a consistency in what he's saying here.
Absolutely. We see Keith has joined us. Well, we'll interject Keith here in just a second. We're glad he's finally.
Sorry, I was doing squats.
Yeah, you were doing squat.
We just applaud the arrival of the diva. We're glad that you
Look, man, I read
Purposely
1030. I didn't see that big EST. I didn't know what that means. I don't speak abbreviations.
All right.
I have many comments to say. I shall keep them to myself.
No, you won't.
Well, you're in good company with Phil. He can't keep the time zone straight either. So
Yeah, evidently.
I type it once and walk away.
Yeah, listen, you're talking guys throwing out Eastern time zone. So
it's the only thing he
all
knows.
of us, or is it you?
It's very self-centered, don't you think, Keith?
Man. Hey, listen, glad to be here, guys. For real, though. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I'm 4 minutes late to the party, but I do appreciate the invite. I'm looking forward to this. So,
we're glad to have you back on track, Phil. I think you were talking before we had to applause the entry of rock star status Stoneheart.
So what we got going on here in a couple of ways, and I think actually Adam was doing a good job of explaining the first step of things, the connector in verse 7. I don't know where I heard it first, but one way to talk about that word, whenever you see therefore, you have to ask the question, what's it there for? What's it there for? So in classic old TV shows, discuss amongst yourselves. I think that was the church ladies. Didn't they have that phrase or something like that? So why is it included? What's the therefore?
Well, I think one of the interesting things in the first 6 verses is that we talked about the idea that yesterday it's the judgment of the rich, and it's in those 6 verses, there's this kind of promise of those who are rich and who don't have the right kind of heart are going to be judged. And it's personified that their gold, their silver, their riches that rust, their treasures, all those things, their wages that they have frauded people with, all those things testify against them on this court scene, this judgment. And it's interesting too I think that's tied back to, as I said yesterday, tied back to chapter 2, where he makes a statement about preferring the rich who drag you to court. And here in the beginning, the rich are being dragged to court. So there's a sense of justice that's presented there. And I think it's interesting that in verse 7, he talks and turns and says, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Well, the coming of the Lord is a statement that always represents that judgment. So the way I see that a little bit is, and maybe I'm wrong, but in those first 6 verses, there's this promised judgment to the rich. And then in verse 7, there's this kind of turn to those who it seems like a little bit could be rich and not rich, but almost the not rich, who are the ones he talks to in chapter 2, of saying this judgment is coming. Be patient, wait on that judgment, be steadfast in this section, going to get towards the end. But do realize judgment is coming. And so he's first 6 verses, rich are going to be judged. Here's the judgment's coming. Therefore, you be patient, wait. And while you're waiting, don't grumble. Don't do things that are going to cause your judgment to be, I would tie it back to the first 6 verses, as bad as the guys in the first 6 verses. You wait for the judgment in a way that's patient and waiting in a way that you'll be judged righteous rather than the way those guys are going to be judged.
Yeah. So Hebrews 6 has a picture there with Abram patiently enduring. I think that's a good contextual cue that these Christians are going to have to endure with patience. And the enduring part matches context. The patient part is a challenge for all of us. I think more and more so, to kind of tie it a little bit to the present tense, folks have been concerned about what worship is going to look like in 1 to 2 months from now, when we're able to safely assemble together again in person. I'm still of the mindset that people are going to be so starved for spiritual interaction of a real, genuine nature that, at least for the church at Eastside, probably for where y'all are at, it's going to be like record packed in participation from the Christians in the area. Like, we're going to be setting out chairs and the hug line is going to be longer than most weddings. At least that's my perception of it. And I think that's a factor of our ability to live in a culture that gives us everything right now. And now we are literally all forced to learn to be patient.
Yeah. I told I told someone the other night in our Wednesday night Bible class that we hold on Zoom, and I said, I might even wear a suit. Yeah, next time we get to assemble.
Don't talk too much.
Don't.
It'll be that big of a deal, because really, I mean, I think you're hitting on something that's crucial, and it's on the minds of everyone. And I know there's a lot of the, I know Terry had a post about the slippery slope argument, and there's a lot of the slippery slope going on right now. And I just, and of course this is a personality thing with me, but I would much rather just be a guy that says, hey, let's do what we have to do now, and we'll worry about a month and a month, but that's just my opinion. And so, considering what these Christians were going through, I know that what we're dealing with right now pales in comparison to what they were dealing with, but I think the principles still are valid.
Well, and I think there's also a principle here of, if you look back in verse 5, it talks about, you've lived luxuriously on the earth, you've fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. That's been the way we have been living, to be honest, the way we live in our religious world in America today. We have the conveniences, and we have the luxuries, and we have pretty much everything just laid out for us, and it's all so very easy. And we are all of a sudden, at least in some small way, experiencing the flip side of that, of what would it be like if we weren't allowed to worship regularly with luxury and ease? What would it be like if we weren't, if we were refused all the conveniences that we're used to? And then you had to make the hard decisions about how do you worship in those difficult times.
Yeah.
We're not facing persecution, but we're facing difficulty. And I think what James gets in here says, be patient, strengthen your heart. The Lord's coming is near. It doesn't matter if this pandemic lasted for the next 20 years. The Lord's coming is near. Be patient. This is all going to work out. Just hold on, and it'll be okay.
Yeah, you look at James 1:12 as another text to kind of put hand in hand with this, under the perception of what we're actually supposed to be waiting for. So we've contextualized it in a present tense setting of, we're waiting for the fellowship of believers, the congregational worship, and the connectedness that comes from offering praise together to God. But James's picture is, like Adam's pointing out, is 2 steps ahead of that. He's talking about crown of life. He's talking about the same race that Paul talks about running, that he desired, longed, wished, hoped to be with God, and yet for now he had to wait. And waiting gets hard. I mean, it's challenging. It's difficult to truly wait for things that are not tangible. I know when I was a kid, when the presents would start stacking up underneath the Christmas tree or whatever, you knew you had a date. On that date, you get to open them all up. We don't have that kind of luxury spiritually to have a date. The same thing is being played out in our physical lives as well.
Well, and I don't want to jump too far ahead of where we are here, but in verse 8, when James says, establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord is at hand. He's, you can look at that phrase and say, it's at hand. And go, well, that's soon, right? But even still, you don't have a date. But I love the fact that he says, establish your hearts. That's a strong phrase that it implies roots, and it implies anchors, and all the other things that we attach to the concept of hope, which is something really now that I think we're probably focused on more than anything when we are talking about our faith in this time and all that stuff. It's really kind of it's wrapped up in this idea of establishing our heart to where there's hope built in. That we know there is a time coming. We have no idea when it's going to be. Like you said, we don't have a the April the 25th is going to be the day that this is all over. Until then, establish your hearts, put your feet down, dig in, and, push ahead.
Yeah, Bob
I do
McPherson
think-
brings in an observation real quick. He says, this waiting is not passive activity. See a farmer. You're waiting for the harvest. You're waiting for the crop. Adam?
Well, and I was going to say that going with that, the farmer concept here that's mentioned in verse 7, you're not waiting blindly when you're a farmer. I mean, you see the plants growing, you see the fruit show up, you just watch it change colors. I mean, you get to see those changes happening and it getting nearer and nearer and nearer every single day. And I think there's a sense of that for us in the church, waiting on the Lord. Every day we're closer to this. Every day, the next day might be the day. And I think sometimes our mindset is, oh, this is some shot in the dark, blind moment that's going to happen sometime far in the future, and we live that way. And James is saying, no, you should be watching this get closer every single day.
I think one of the things that really brings us home to me is we talk about this pandemic, and we think in the terms of the end of it, the light at the end of the tunnel. We have this kind of, and I think that's a very real thing for us right now, because it's a present thing. And it's very much every time we turn on the news, or every time there's a update or a conference or a post or an email, like from my mayor that's staying in touch with a lot of us, we're just reminded over and over and over again, this idea of this is going to end, this is going to end, this is going to end. But at the end of the day, I think it's interesting. I'll try to adjust that for you. It's kind of interesting to think in the areas of eternally and the day of judgment. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I think about that with the same certainty and the same expectation that I'm thinking about the end of the pandemic, because I have a tendency to think so much more short-sighted, fleshly, carnal, how things impact me now. And really the point of this text, as Adam pointed to earlier, is really pointing towards waiting on that moment. And I think one of the things about that is that this kind of steadfastness is the need for all of us to wake up every day thinking about living today for that appointment that we have to keep. And that's the challenge. And that gets back to what we talked about earlier about setting your mind on spiritual things, setting your mind on things above. We've had some of those commentary throughout this study, and that's really what James is trying to focus on. That's quite the contrast back to the first 6 verses that was all fleshly, short-sighted. How do I profit myself for the rich, versus this, which is long-term. This is about the riches in heaven. This is about what's to come, and just a completely different mindset in these two texts.
Reminds me of Philippians chapter 1. I've been studying through Philippians lately, and it's interesting how Paul will talk there in an encouraging and positive way about his imprisonment. He's experiencing a very real, present distress. And he talks about, I might get out of this, I might not. I'm pretty sure I'm going to, based on your prayers. And he talks about this expectant hope of getting out of imprisonment. But if you look there in verse 20, my eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all courage, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And so Paul, while he had a present expectation of things returning to normal, ultimately that's not what he was concerned about. He was concerned about life or death. In the end, will Christ be glorified by the way that I live? And I think that's what James is getting to here. Is Christ glorified in the decisions we're making and the way that we're living? Are we, as Keith pointed out, strengthening our heart? Are we really holding on?
Yeah. So a couple things I think are other connections to the present tense, because one of the things we try to do with the text of James is not just understand what James was teaching the Christians who were being dispersed, is to teach us. In the first 2 weeks of whatever you want to call our present distress, distressing present or painful caging. I had 70 conversations with different preachers, teachers, congregations about how to set up live streaming and how to do what Terry and I have been doing for a while. And I got to tell you, I was getting a little cranky.
That was not a little cranky, by the way.
I was getting cranky. And it's just because, you already have 12, 13-hour days. Sometimes when you're preaching now, I was at like 18-hour days, 19-hour days. And the questions started to blend together. Like, how do I do this? I'll press the button and press go. It's not working. All that typical tech support stuff, stress. And eventually it's kind of all quieted down. Everyone's kind of gotten into their, application space where they're doing what they want to do. But it's really easy to look at verse 9 and think about, do not grumble against one another, brothers. And to think about the application of the context of it for these Christians and for us as Christians. We're all going to get cranky. We're all caged in boxes right now. The Christians in the first century, these Christians were losing everything they had, and selfishness and anger and pride and malice and all the works of the flesh can easily manifest themselves in that environment. And so it's a powerful admonition here in a much more gentle way than the earlier ones. That's for all of us. I think there's some deep soul searching that has to be taking place because of the second clause of verse 9. So that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. He's gone back to that legal, righteous, sanctified kind of picture that James has been using a lot.
That phrase reminded me, earlier we tied I think yesterday or the day before, we tied part of this back to Cain and Abel. It was yesterday, the crying out, and to the crying out of Abel's blood from the ground. And this is another, it just reminded me, God tells Cain sin is crouching at the door. And interesting to kind of see those two things. And here it's the judge, but it's really the same kind of concept in the idea there. And it just kind of was interesting to see both of those phrases from Genesis 4 kind of pop into this discussion of James 5.
I've seen a lot of this in our present situation where there's been a lot of chatter among brethren about what other brethren are doing or not doing as they try to make difficult decisions during this whole event. And I find it interesting that James's concern here is not that they'll complain about what they're suffering. He says, don't complain about one another. Yeah. So the complaining going on is not about the circumstances. It's their relationship issues. And I see that a lot right now. There's enough complaining going on about being stuck at home and how difficult that is, and whether there's toilet paper on the grocery shelves or not. But it is the complaining that's really standing out is when we're complaining about each other. This church is doing it wrong. This church isn't doing what the church where I attend is doing, and us justifying ourselves instead of just realizing we're all facing a difficult time. Yeah. We're all doing our best. We need to believe in one another.
I feel like I'm living in Groundhog Day, and I saw that reference on the news this morning. But you wake up and it's like the same thing every day. You can't go anywhere, same thing. And I remember in Groundhog Day, which, by the way, great movie.
Yeah.
That there comes a point where he gets so tired of it. You remember that he's just angry to everybody. He just kind of attacks everybody in his path, and that doesn't change anything.
Poor Ned Ryerson.
And I think, yeah, Ned Needlemeyer.
Needlemeyer?
There's all these. You have all these. I think we're getting close to that point where it's like we're so tired of this. Like it's just okay. I've tried to love you. Now I'm going to just be angry all the time.
Yeah,
which isn't good either. And it just, when you're talking about that, it just reminds me of that reference. And it's difficult, man. And you plug onto Facebook and you see you just see continually this chatter, debate, argument, judgment, criticism. And, I'm just going to say this about that. We've had enough of that. It's time to move on. Just realize we're all doing the best we can right now. And the worst thing we can do is judge and murmur and complain and grumble against each other in the middle of this difficult time.
And I'll tell you, I mean, that's been difficult for me, if I'm just being transparent, is it because when I see the ones who are, accusatory and, making claims and all this stuff, obviously, like you said, my first, inclination is to love them and be patient and understand that they're doing the same thing we are. They're trying to figure out what's right. But after day 4 or 5 of it, then I'm in danger of being the grumbler, right? I start thinking the worst of them, and especially when you see it, like if it begins to affect your congregation where you are, right? I mean, what they're doing to their congregation, is their business. That's the beauty of autonomy. But at the same time, it begins to affect people in your congregation, and you get people in your congregation that send you messages and says, "Hey, I don't really know if we should be doing this or not." Now you've created a mess here. Yeah. And so it's hard not to get negative, in a negative mind space,
or just defensive. Just personally defensive. Here's something to think about, and this occurs in the text, verse 10, and I think it's an important divide we have to make.
I was going to head to verse 10 too because of that comment. Go ahead, Phil.
In verse 10, the focus goes to the prophets, and it puts it in a spiritual conflict zone. And right now, as I understand our challenges, we're not really dealing with this kind of level of spiritual persecution because let's just take Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet that we can use really quickly, and we think about his practical service to the king, to Jehovah, to Elohim, as a prophet, and what he endured in that process. He was plotted against in his hometown, and in those in Judah as well, Jeremiah 11, Jeremiah 18. Rejected by those of his own house, Jeremiah 12:6. Beaten by the elders and the priests, Jeremiah 20. Captured and sentenced to death because he was depressing in his speech. Thrown in prison. His message was pretty much sour from beginning to end because that was where God was placing Israel. He was tossed into a pit. Israel looked at Jeremiah as a false teacher. You want to know what legitimate spiritual persecution looks like? James just gave us the list, in essence, to say the prophets. Go the prophets. What we're dealing with is challenging but different.
And at the same time, you've got Ezekiel with the people in captivity who's being rejected and looked at like he's a madman because of what God is asking him to do. And so the reality is, at the end of the day, and all of those and all the prophets, there's some part of that pretty much of a persecution factor. And look, there's a lot of people that are trying to turn this into some kind of form of persecution and suffering that is in some way close to being on the verge of the edge of the equivalency of the first century persecution of the prophets. And I just want to tell you guys that are looking at some of these things like stay in place orders and what's happening to some churches who are violating the government's sometimes not even suggestions but requirements. We are not even close to that. You need to realize, and if you think we are, I just want to tell you we're not. You need to dive a little deeper into that.
Well, and again, go ahead.
No, I'll go last. I'm good. I'm good to have others.
I was just going to say, what we're going through isn't really persecution at all. It's just circumstances. And I think we need to be careful that we're not trying to draw parallels that aren't there. I mean, we go through persecution. We as Christians, not obviously to the extent of what they did in the first century, but I mean, Jesus defines it in the Sermon on the Mount of, blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. Well, we do deal with some of that, even in our modern society. But our current predicament is not that. Our current predicament is just circumstance. But I think we're opening ourselves up to persecution because of the way we handle the relationship side, the way we talk about others, the way we're displaying not Christ's character publicly on social media, but displaying something else. And again, that's going to be persecution, not that is falsely said against us, but truthful statements against us, because we're kind of showing our hand more than we probably should, if that's our attitude.
Yeah, it's funny that people want to kind of compare this to persecution of the first century. The thing I thought about that's more probably equivalent is like when Paul was shipwrecked at sea. That wasn't a persecution. That was just an experience and circumstances that happened beyond his control. You adjust to that. That's what we have now. This is like a form of that shipwreck for us. And we're treading water until we can get back to shore when things are going to be fine and we can resume our normal practices.
This kid I know from the West Coast who used to sit in Bible classes I was teaching and talked about preaching someday comments, is this a problem of our time? Many people have kind of a sick obsession with their own drama. People want to be the victims or heroes of well-scripted drama. And I'll say absolutely, RG, whose name is known by some. Ryan, it's good to have you part of the conversation today. I just like to hassle you a little bit. I think that's absolutely true. I think there's probably a tenor of everyone's watched X number of reality TV shows and wants another chunk of fame, and now here's a chance, and that affects culture. I mean, that's nothing new. If you go back to 1910 to 1920 with the Spanish flu, right after that you had a rise of shift in spiritual perceptions of things, a second wave of Pentecostal churches growing out of that, especially after the war to end all wars, World War I. There's all those kind of cultural pushes that drag or pull or tug on us. And James is dealing with much of that in a spiritual context and expanding it to teach them more about how Jesus wanted us to be. I think that's part of the James tenor is he's telling us as disciples, we have to rise and be better than we have been. Because he's telling these disciples, you have to rise and be better than you were.
Well, and I think James keeps it in that context. If you keep reading verse 11 and 12, or verse 11, he uses Job. Well, Job didn't suffer as a result of persecution. He suffered as a result of circumstances. It was these bad things happening to him, and he had to figure out how to tread that water and get through those difficult moments. And so it says that he had endurance, and because he had endurance, the Lord saw him through it, because God is compassionate and merciful. That's more akin to what we're dealing with. We're treading that water. Just keep going, and God will see you through it.
Well, and I see a repeating pattern that obviously, we see here in James. We also see it like in Ephesians with Paul. We see it with Peter, where we see the words like steadfast. We see the words compassionate. We see the words merciful. We see the words humble. In Ephesians, where Paul talks about striving for unity. It's not coincidental that in these times where tensions are high, those are the words given. That there is to be a deliberate effort on our part to be steadfast. There is to be a deliberate effort on our part to be humble. There's a deliberate effort, an intentional effort to be merciful and compassionate, because that's how unity is achieved. It's not about us all being on the same page at the same time. It's about the push forward to get closer together. In times where we're dealing with, Terry, you nailed it. We're not dealing with persecution at all in this regard. This is uncomfortable, right? And as Americans, we are very passionate about our comfort. And Right now, we're all uncomfortable and we don't like it. And so it feels like persecution, but really, we're inconvenienced. And so words like this really jump off the page at me when you see him use the word patient up in verse 7, you know, and then you see it again in verse 8. And then, you know, the idea of establishing your hearts. And, you know, then you see, you know, patience again in verse 9. You see steadfast and steadfastness used in verse 11. I mean, it's just this over and over. I think he's trying to tell us something, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think he's really trying to communicate here.
So I don't think Ryan intended it this way because he was probably talking about the American Civil War, but you could talk about a different Civil War in which folks who are getting along are torn apart, which is kind of what a Civil War is. But in a thematic sense, the recent movie, it's probably about 5 or 6 years ago, had a group of folks who were designed to stay together, work together, and protect everybody who are now fighting against each other. That's basically local churches in some communities right now.
Right.
They're fighting with each other rather than protecting the sheep.
It's never a bad time for a Marvel reference.
No, if I can bring in pop culture, I'm going to do it. I'm down.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm there. I'm with you.
By the way, I love in verse 11 these last two little phrases. You have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. I mean, just think about that statement. The purpose of the Lord is compassionate and merciful.
Well, and
I wonder sometimes if we realize the purpose of the Lord is compassionate and merciful.
We read over that. We read over that it's a detail that gets lost, and we focus on words like judgment. We focus on words like, you know, patient and suffering. We skip over that because it's just we see it as filler. But that word purpose means something. It holds some weight.
Well, and I find it interesting that in this passage, the one consistency, and really through the whole book of James, the one consistency is God. You know, we're going to have various circumstances. We're going to face persecution. Sometimes we're going to have times of peace. We're going to have trials of faith. We're going to deal with economic distress. We're going to have all these things we're going to deal with, and a lot of decisions that we have to make about what to do in those circumstances. The one consistent thing you can count on the whole way through is that God is compassionate and merciful, that God is on your side, that God is cheering for you, that God wants you to win this thing, and God is getting closer and closer and closer every single day. Just hold on, keep making the hard decisions, hold on, God will be there.
All right, guys.
And I think
hold on a second, Terry.
Well, let me say real quick. I just want to say, I think sometimes we think we're becoming more like God when we become more judgy and critical and try to force people to establish and hold to our form of the truth. But being more compassionate and merciful is actually what makes us more like God.
Yeah.
Well, and since Philip's always content with going last,
I was just going to say, go around the horn, everybody. It's about time to go.
I think that to your point, Terry, I think that's what people think unity is that if I force you into my view, right, that's unity. That's uniformity, right? Uniformity says you must do everything the way I do it. You must see everything the way I see it. You must be just like me, as opposed to unity, which doesn't, that concept is completely the opposite. Unity and uniformity are not the same thing. And I think what most Christians do with the judgy and the preachy and the legalistic mindset says, well, unity is doing what I do, but that's uniformity. That's not unity.
Yeah. Around the horn. Who's starting?
Adam's starting.
I don't even know what around the horn is.
Yeah.
You get one last shot to say something.
Yes.
My one last shot to say something would be this, going off of what Keith just said. Years ago, I was sitting down with a Baptist minister when I first started preaching, and I was offering, I was a young guy, early 20s, and I said, hey, I'd love to sit down and just hear things from your perspective. I just want to learn, and I knew what I believed, but I wanted to hear it from his perspective. And he basically made the comment of, well, you know what? Some of us like chicken and some of us like steak, and that's okay. And his idea was, we can all just agree to disagree and we'll all be fine. That's obviously not the point, not the case, or not what Keith is saying. We need to realize that the goal is to like what God likes. It's not about people liking what I like and people agreeing with me. It's about me liking what God likes. And if I'll do that, then we can be unified. And what God likes is compassion and mercy.
Keith?
I really kind of did it in the last go round. I mean, that
we can pass over. You're good. Terry, what you got?
Oh, just I think everything's been said, and just want to thank Keith and Adam for joining us. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to it. Just want to make a mention of we've talked about a lot of people on here who are in need of our prayers and frontline workers and so forth. Phil, you and I have a classmate who is at least potentially being considered as having this virus, and that's Frederick Gray. While he doesn't show a lot of symptoms, he had a fever the other day. I heard of 105. And that is complicated by the fact that his wife and kids are not with him because they are caretaking for her father, who's also fighting cancer.
Yeah.
And I know you know them well, Phil. I just want to ask people to pray for Frederick and Heather and their families as they're separated during this tough time. Frederick preaches down in Tampa at the Seminole congregation and is a really, really great laborer in the vineyard, and we just want to think about him today.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us, guys. Keith, go back to the squat rack and do a second set for us. Get a second set. Adam,
can we eat tacos while we watch Keith squat? I think that's the plan today.
I eat tacos while I squat. I mean, you got to fuel, man. You got to fuel.
Gotta get the protein. I need more chicken.
Yeah.
So one last tie-in, I think, is textual is important, and we can also make a Marvel reference. There will be an eventual avenging of the prophets. There will be an eventual avenging of the persecuted. And when we reach a point that we ourselves are involved in the persecution of the world that's fueled by the hearts of the devil, there'll be an avenging for that too. And that's not our thing to plan out or take into our handles. What James is telling us and preparing us to do is to be mindful of who we are as we walk in Christ, as we're disciples. It's something that's necessary for us to do. I really want to encourage everyone to seek out good choices for today, to recognize that in the midst of our present distress and the circumstances that we're in, there's good. There's positives that are to be found every day. Prepare to help, prepare to encourage. And as we have been trying to do at the close of each of our times in this study, is remember that our desire is that God would bless you in all that he does and all that he can in every way possible.